Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host, and today I'm going to talk to you about the visit of Indonesian president to India. He was the chief guest for India's celebration of its 76th Republic Day. So I'm going to talk about the possibility of very strong strategic partnerships between India and Indonesia, the historical and cultural connections that already exist, and how these cultural and historical connections can be translated into probably strategic and geopolitical partnerships going forward. But I will also take this as an opportunity to reflect a little bit about Indonesia. I'm sure the Indonesians know more about Indonesia than I do, but there are people in India who might be curious about Indonesia, where it is militarily, economically, and otherwise. So I'm not an expert on Indonesia. I have visited Indonesia more than once. I've done a very important video on Islam and democracy in Indonesia with a very prominent scholar of Indonesia, Robert Hefner, who is, at that time at least, he was the president of the Anthropology Association. So he's clearly one of the most important scholars of modern Indonesia, and he did come on Khanversations. I'm grateful to him. At the end of this video, I will post a link to that video, and you can watch that and benefit from his insights too. So today I'm going to basically talk about India and Indonesia, and I will talk about a little bit more about Indonesia. What little knowledge I have, I will share that with you. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon, and share this video with your socio-political network. So the first thing that I want to point out is that the way I see it is this is a very important, shall we say, coming together, the world's biggest democracy and the world's biggest Muslim democracy. India is clearly the world's biggest democracy. It has the biggest election, primarily because it's a democracy and it has the world's largest population. Indonesia is the fourth biggest country when it comes with population after India, China, and the US. It is the world's third biggest democracy after India and the US, and it is the biggest Muslim democracy. That part is very important because both Malaysia and Indonesia these days are competing to provide a model of Muslim democracy. At least on the democracy index, Malaysia ranks a bit higher than Indonesia. In fact, Malaysia ranks higher than India also on the democracy index that is provided by the Economist Intelligence Unit. But what is important is that these countries, especially countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, and until recently Bangladesh, these countries were doing well economically and were also trying to at least send the signal to Muslims to the west side of India, in the Arab world, etc., that you can have a Muslim country which is both democratic and economically developing and becoming prosperous, empowering women, focusing on education and investments, etc. So these are good models for the rest of the Arab world to emulate, especially that part of the Arab world which does not have oil and therefore are looking for models for development. And those Arab countries which do have oil, they can look at the possibility of what a modern Muslim democracy can look like by looking at Indonesia and Malaysia. India and Indonesia have ties that go back to thousands of years. India has been kind of an exporter of religion to Indonesia. Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam all came to Indonesia from India primarily. So in that sense, India is the fountainhead of culture and values and religion and principles that came to India. The Indonesian language, Bahasa, is heavily influenced by Sanskrit. And in fact, many of the names that Indonesians have are Sanskritized. There are a lot of Sanskritized words in Bahasa. If you remember Panchashila, the 5 principles, if you knew Sanskrit, you could have translated that easily. What's also interesting is that if you go to one of the most important islands of Indonesia, which is Bali, you can see the Hindu culture there and Indian influence there quite strikingly. In fact, there's no place like Bali in India. But so you could argue that you see the eclectic culture of India and Indonesia in Bali quite prominently. And the fact that that Hindu minorities are so well integrated into the Indonesian society also is a plus for Indonesia as a democracy, as a rapidly growing democracy. In the last 10 years, Indonesia has made very positive strides on the democracy path as well as on the economic path, primarily during the 10 years of Joko Widodo, who was president from 2014 till 2024. We will talk about Prabowo Subianto, who is now the president of Indonesia, who's visiting India a bit more. So India has been using the Republic Day not only to celebrate its status as a constitutional democracy. It starts with 1950s. India's constitution was then developed and then it was ratified. And so 26th January is when India celebrates essentially the ratification of its constitution in a way, and it becomes a republic. And so that's why it's called a Republic Day, even though it became independent on 15th of August in 1947. So it took about 2.5 years to come up with a constitution. It's a very interesting story. I will tell you that story some other time. Interestingly, this is the fourth Indonesian president to visit India on the Republic Day, and the first Republic Day that was celebrated in 1950. The chief guest at that time was Sukarno, who was the president of Indonesia. So in the last 76 years, you could say that it's bookended by Sukarno and Subianto. In fact, if you're looking at this photograph, this is a photograph of Sukarno and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, his daughter Indira Gandhi, who became the first and the only female prime minister of India, the head of government. But in the picture, you can also see Megawati Sukarno Putri, his daughter, who also became the first female president of Indonesia and also a Muslim woman to become a head of government in Asia. Asia has had many women heads of states. In fact, in South Asia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India have all had women heads of governments. So it's a remarkable aspect of this culture. So India has used this to celebrate India's stature internationally, to celebrate its democracy, to signal the importance that India's constitution plays. But it also puts India on the international stage. So it's a very interesting development. Donald Trump tried to do this with his inauguration right now. Until then, it was mostly a domestic affair. So we did not internationalize, even though American presidents have so much impact on global politics. So it is a tribute to India's vision that from the very beginning, it sought to internationalize its stature and status, its democracy and its republic and its constitution by celebrating the Republic Day so prominently and inviting prominent foreign guests. It's not just that there's a chief guest who is a foreign head of state usually, but there are also lots of other international guests who come to the celebration. Some of the prominent guests that you might know of are Barack Obama, who came, I think, in 2015. Of course, Macron was there last year. Now, just the fact that Subianto is there and the chief guest at India's Republic Day does not necessarily signal some major diplomatic progress really going forward. Because two years ago, Egypt's President General Sisi was the chief guest, and we haven't seen any significant development in India-Egypt relations, partly because of the war also, but partly. So it does not necessarily signal anything major, but it could be that of all the major heads of state, this guy was available and India invited him. So for example, there was a lot of talk of Joe Biden coming to India for the Republic Day, and he didn't, and then Macron or Sisi, I don't remember which one of the two became his substitute. So we should not read too much into Subianto just being the guest. On the other side, Subianto himself is quite like Narendra Modi. He is interested in a lot of international travel, and he's been traveling quite widely internationally. He officially took over in October of 2024, and he's already traveled to many countries. In fact, even before he was sworn in as president, he had already traveled to from 21 countries internationally. So this is some commentators in Indonesia are calling this status-seeking behavior, that Subianto is going around to elevate his own personal status, but in the process, you also elevate the status of Indonesia. I would probably not have done this conversation on Indonesia if he was not visiting India. So there must be lots and lots of articles in newspapers, especially in India, in the subcontinent, lots of television shows talking about Indonesia. So it's a good thing that he's doing this. His first trip, needless to say, as soon as he became president, was to go to China. And there was some controversy because they agreed upon a $10 billion investment plan. So China is going to invest. There were a lot of private sector to private sector and other deals made. But there's a lot of criticism that perhaps he has allowed China so much control on certain islands in Indonesia through this deal that he's kind of sort of surrendering sovereignty over certain islands, especially in the Natuna Islands in the South China Sea. Well, it depends on how people view this, but the point is that he has attracted $10 billion of additional investments into Indonesia. And then, of course, after that, he met with Joe Biden, and as usual, he got nothing from the United States except a photo op. These days, US has nothing to offer to the rest of the world. All we have to do is give bombs to Israel so it can kill Palestinians, and give bombs to Ukrainians so it can kill Russians. We have become just an arms dealer to the world, and we don't, at least under Biden, we didn't provide anything good, at least. And under Donald Trump now, we just threaten to invade and annex either Greenland or the Panama Canal or even Canada. Anyway, so Subianto's international travel then took him to Brazil, South America, where he visited 3 countries. And while he was in Brazil, they announced that Indonesia had become the full member of BRICS. So India is also part of BRICS, and Indonesia is also part of BRICS. Indonesia and India were the founding members of the non-aligned movement, if you remember, way back in the heydays of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And so there is a long history of India and Indonesia being partners, important partners in the global politics. A little bit more about Indonesia. Indonesia for the last 10 years has been doing phenomenally well, to such an extent that it has now reached an economy of the size of $1.4 trillion. For a country which has a 218 million population, the 4th largest population, it's not yet in the top 10, but it's been growing steadily for the last 10 years at 5%. And the per capita income of Indonesia is $5,000, literally double that of India. So while India is the fastest growing economy among major economies, India is also now the 5th biggest economy, soon to become the 3rd biggest economy, but India's per capita income is still just $2,500, $2,600. And Indonesia is around $4,900 to $5,000 at the moment. So India is in the low middle income category according to the World Bank, whereas Indonesia is in the high middle income economy. But both the countries are in middle income countries, and both face the same challenges that developing countries are facing in the past 20, 30 years, which is somehow not to get stuck in the middle income trap. And I have discussed this in the context of Indian economy elsewhere as to what the middle income trap is. But Indonesia, like India, also has the problem of how to escape the middle income trap. India's prime minister has a vision of Viksit Bharat, of a developed India by 2047. The Indonesians have a vision of golden Indonesia by 2045. Indonesia became independent in 1945, so they hope that by the time they are 100 years old, modern independent Indonesia, they become a modern developed country, like a first world country, which means according to the World Bank, they want to be classified as a high income economy, more developed. I don't know whether they have specific goals on the Human Development Index. India does not talk about it in terms of Human Development Index. Indian discussions of Viksit Bharat is usually broadly in the context of GDP and GDP per capita. So So both these countries are on similar trajectory. In fact, their economic policy is also very similar. They are more or less following the China model. So the growth is coming from investments in infrastructure. Apparently, that every time you talk to Joko Widodo, when he was president, he would pull out his laptop and show all the pictures of bridges and roads and how many miles of roadways he has built, etc. They are now building a whole new city, a new capital. And so there are lots of similarities in the pathway to development that Indonesia and India have. They are all trying to transition into manufacturing. One of the interesting things about Indonesia is that Indonesia is the biggest producer of nickel. In fact, I think it produces more than 50% of the nickel that is produced all over the world. In the past, it used to export that. So most of Indonesia's exports were primarily from mining sector. But since 2020, when exporting nickels was banned, it has become a source of attracting foreign direct investments. So people are coming in investing in Indonesia. And nickel is very important. It's not only used in manufacturing of stainless steel, but it is also critical for batteries. And so it's an important ingredient into green energy, so solar batteries, etc. So what they want to do is, their strategy is that they want downstream investment, which means that they want foreign companies, rather than just buying nickel and then building batteries and solar cells, etc. Elsewhere, what they want them to do is to come to Indonesia and invest in not just building batteries, but also electric vehicles. So you see Indonesia now manufacturing electric motorbikes, electric cars, and they're hoping also to become a major player in the manufacturing of electric vehicles. And they hope that by not exporting nickel, they are forcing those who are trying to enter into the green economies to come and invest. And so they have been attracting about $50 billion a year of foreign direct investments, which is pretty good for Indonesia. But Indonesia has the same problem as India. They're not going to hit their benchmarks if they are going to grow at 5%. Both in India is growing at 6.5%, and Indonesia at 5%. These countries will have to hit 8-9% growth rates consistently for a couple of decades if they really want to become developed economies with GDPs in the $20,000 range. In fact, talking about electric vehicles, I was in Indonesia a few years ago, and my wife and my daughter and I, we actually rented electric bicycles. We went around the islands. So it's a major tourist attraction in Bali, where you can ride bicycles, etc. And my wife and my daughter also got a glimpse of the Indian-ness of Indonesia. We were in Yogyakarta, and they attended a performance of Ramayana, which is very prominent there. So Mahabharata and Ramayana are enacted in a very interesting, authentic fashion in Indonesia. So you can see the influence of Indian culture quite apparent in cultural products of Indonesia. India and Indonesia's trade relations are emerging, developing. I think Indonesia is, the sixth biggest trading partner of India. The total trade is about $30 billion between India and Indonesia. India exports about $6 billion and imports $24 billion. So in that sense, you could argue that Indonesia's exports to India are 4 times that of India's exports to Indonesia. I'm sure that both the countries are talking about elevating that number to around 50 billion by 2030. We will see that. But what is interesting is that the joining of BRICS, Indonesia, and we will see for a long time, Indonesian military had very close ties with the US military, and there was a lot of dependence there. this particular move of joining BRICS, which some people are saying Subianto did this essentially to elevate his own personal stature in the international arena, but we will see how the United States reacts to to Indonesia's membership in BRICS. Uh, Indonesia has the potential to become a major leader in the East Asian context. It is the biggest country in ASEAN. In terms of population, obviously 280. It is the biggest Asian country other than China and India. In East Asia, its economy is growing rapidly. It is expected that within 20 to 30 years, Indonesia will become the fourth biggest economy in the world. That is China, India, US, and Indonesia. And if it continues to grow in that fashion and remains a democracy while it is doing that, then it can become a very important player in the world. In fact, the top three economies in the world would be Asian economies. So this vision of multipolar world would become far more real if more and more Asian countries stay on the path of development, do not allow domestic politics to basically undermine their growth. And so there's a pretty good chance that Indonesia will become a major global player, far more important than France, Germany, or Great Britain at the moment. Asia is rapidly replacing Europe as the engine of economic growth and development of the world. And along with their large populations, they will have large economies. So if you look at forecasts, say 30, 40 years from now, in the top 10, you will not see many European countries. In fact, I think the only Western country in the top 10 economies would be India. And if you count Brazil as a Western country, then it would be there. But at the moment, these are all countries of the global South, which will be part. So basically, BRICS will dominate the top 10 economies of the world going forward, and Indonesia is going to be an important player. As the world becomes more and more multipolar, and we see countries like India and Brazil, along with Indonesia, playing a bigger role in how international politics are shaped. In fact, what the rules of governing world politics will be determined by these countries in a truly multipolar world. So I think that it's an interesting thing that India invited the president of Indonesia to come. There was some controversy in the beginning. He was going to go to Pakistan immediately after visiting India, and it was something that Indians didn't like it. So he has accepted India's criticism and has decided to go to Malaysia instead from New Delhi directly. There were lots of interesting things going on. Subianto, in his speech, declared that he recently had his DNA checked and found out that he has Indian DNA, and and said that that probably explains why he enjoys Indian music such a lot. And the delegation from Indonesia actually sang a famous Indian song. And so there's all this talk about, oh, we are, culturally we are kumbaya, but let us see how it goes. As I said, that these countries have historically been great partners in international arena, but things have been very different. For example, India is part of the Quad. Indonesia is not part of the Quad. Logically speaking, Indonesia should have been part of the Quad, the Squad, as well as AUKUS, and given its geographical location, but it's not. While I was preparing for this conversations, I realized something which I had never realized before, that India and Indonesia are neighbors in a way. So some of the islands which are part of the Indonesian archipelago are very close to Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So the maritime boundaries of Indonesia and India are sort of made them neighbors. And as someone who lived in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, I lived there for 3 years in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I find that I was Indonesia's neighbor for 3 years. Anyway, that's all I have to share about Indonesia, and we will see. Mr. Subianto is an interesting person. much different from Widodo. Widodo was very domestic focused, focused on developing and making Indonesia rich, and also contributed to further democratization. But there's some nepotism going on there. The vice president of Mr. Subianto is the son of Widodo. We will see what happens going forward. Subianto comes from the military. So I'm assuming there are, well, I don't want to assume, but the chances of there being authoritarian streaks are quite there. But anyway, so that's all I have to share about Indonesia for the moment. Please subscribe to Khanversations, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share this video with your socio-political network. For all of you who are watching in India, happy Republic Day.